Great. Well, happy Friday, everyone. We're going to cover the topic of sleep today, which is our second of three vaguely related concepts under this idea of consciousness. And so we've framed sleep as an altered state of consciousness, which is how they've justified it being in this chapter. So we're going to finish this topic, and then next week we'll look at altered states of consciousness, which will include things like hypnosis and meditation, as well as substances that can alter consciousness. So we could spend tons and tons of time talking about how we regulate sleep. It is a whole process. I spend more than a week on just the genes involved in regulating our biological clocks in one of my genetic courses, so we could spend forever here. But instead, I'm going to boil it down to 2 slides and focus in on those extra important factors. So we're going to care about 2 structures. The first is our suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. That's that little red spot over there near our hypothalamus. And that's sort of our control center for sleep regulation. It's going to send a signal to our pineal gland so that the pineal gland will release melatonin. And melatonin is a hormone that helps us regulate our biological clock. So what happens is that when we're exposed to light, that sends a signal to that SCN that sort of resets our biological clock. It lets us know that it's morning, and then it keeps track of time so that a certain number of hours later, about when it's time for us to go to bed, we start releasing melatonin that helps us transition over to falling asleep. And there are tons of different genes that are involved in this pathway, and we can have mutations that sort of adjust our biological sleep so that we sometimes have longer sleep cycles. So instead of 24 hours, we might be longer than that. We might have them that they're shorter than that. We can also have individuals who have sort of delayed onset sleep cycles, where exposure to light doesn't cause sleep at sleep time. It would cause it either too early or much too late. There's all sorts of interesting little things that can go wrong that adjust how we sleep. But that's one of the reasons why so many people have different preferences as to whether they get up early or stay up late or both or neither. A lot of it's based on our biology. But these biological cycles, when they're on a daily cycle, we can call them circadian rhythms. So they follow a daily sort of loop where we're awake for part of the day, we're asleep for part of the day, and then back again. And while we're cycling through this, it's not just our sort of alertness, as we're very awake and alert when we're awake, and we're unaware of things while we're asleep, but we also have things like cycling in our melatonin levels, as we'd expect, since it is part of helping us fall asleep. But we also have changes in body temperature. So when we're awake, our body temperature is a little bit higher, and when we're asleep, it's a little bit lower. And this graph makes it look very, very dramatic, but in fact, that's only a shift of slightly less than a single degree Celsius. So you're going to swing a couple of fractions of a degree during the day and into the night. But they've adjusted the axis so it looks like a very dramatic swing. So we have all sorts of things in our body that cycle along with this pattern, but sleep is the one that we care about today. And so in order to talk about our different sleep stages, we're going to sort of refresh our memory of electroencephalograms, or EEGs. And so these help us measure electrical activity on the surface of the brain. So we have a nice clear image of an EEG cap on a participant. And so this would let us monitor what their brain is doing during different stages of being awake versus asleep. And so we've kind of looked at these previously when we were looking at different methods of studying the brain. But when we're viewing, sort of say, a single line that has that variation in firing, we're usually looking at a single electrode. For ease of interpretation, we're sort of looking at one at a time, and we're going to specifically pick ones that very nicely show exactly what characterizes each stage of sleep. So if you were looking at real EEG data, you'd probably have an entire page full of dozens of different EEG outputs, different electrode outputs. But we're just going to look at one sort of perfect example for each. We can also have other things, so like an electrooculograph would study eye movements, give us a printout of all the muscles in our eyes are moving. We can have electromyographs, which study our muscle movements in the rest of our body. We would probably have a heart rate monitor. We might even measure sort of breathing rate and all of those things, just to figure out what our body's doing at different stages. But for these stages, we're going to talk about 5 stages of sleep, and each source tends to divide these up a little bit strangely. We'll find that we'll talk about stage 1 and stage 2, and then we're going to group stages 3 and 4 together, and then stage 5 is something completely separate. So just so you're aware that it's not necessarily as hard of a division as what you would be presented to believe in the textbook. So it isn't like there's an automatic switch between stage 1 and stage 2 or stage 3 and stage 4. What we actually find is it's sort of a gradual transition, and then we make the determination that we're in whatever that next stage is once we've hit those characteristics that typify that stage. So I'm going to point out what each of those sort of important factors are that let us know what stage we're in presently. But to start, we can kind of orient ourselves with these EEG outputs. So this is a graph showing the output of a single electrode, as I said, and across the bottom on our x-axis we have time. They've shown us that 1 second is about that distance. The distance isn't super relevant for us. And then our vertical axis, the y-axis, is our amplitude, so that's just our voltage. So the same as when we were looking at sound waves or even waves for light. We care about sort of our wavelengths or our frequency, so how close together or far apart are those peaks, as well as our amplitude, so how much energy or how little energy is in each of those waves. So a high amplitude wave would be an electrical signal that has lots of potential. And then if we have things that are spread out, they're a lot lower frequency, we have less peaks per unit time. Or if they're condensed, they're high frequency, so lots of firing in a short amount of time. Okay, so that sets us up with what we're looking at. And when we're awake or alert, we have mostly beta waves. That's our resting state, is our brain doing a little bit of activity, kind of spread out, that's fine. As we start relaxing, we see that we're having a little bit higher peaks as we sort of drop into what are called alpha waves. So the beta waves are going to be a little bit shorter, a little bit lower amplitude, and then as we relax, we get into higher amplitude. And you're actually going to find that as we move into sort of deeper and deeper stages of sleep, we start getting larger and larger amplitude in our brain waves. And so we'll start seeing that pattern. But stage 1 is where we're starting, where we first actually transition over into sleep. So this is our transition to light sleep. This is the first minute up to about 10 minutes of sleeping. So we'll usually either completely fall asleep and go into stage 2, or we'll wake up while we're in this stage. So we don't stay in a transition state for too long. And so our indicator here that we've entered into stage 1 are theta waves. So these are a little bit lower frequency, so more spread out waves. They're still sort of moderate amplitude, but we're seeing that they're spreading out a lot more. So our brain is firing a lot more slowly. We're getting less peaks per unit time. So we see little clusters of theta waves, and that tells us that we're just starting to fall asleep. We're in that stage 1 sleep. And so during this time, we might have what are called hypnic or myoclonic jerks. So when you're starting to fall asleep, maybe you feel like you're falling and your body jolts you awake. That's what that is. The idea is that your brain sort of erroneously thinks that you're dying because your heart rate has slowed and everything's shutting down. So it sends that jolt to make sure that you're still okay. But that usually happens during this stage, and it might be accompanied by hypnagogic imagery. So thinking that you're falling might come from sort of that sort of a visual of movement or something like that. So just stuff that's triggered in your brain. And so once we've decided that we're transitioning from this light sleep into a deeper sleep, we're going to enter into stage 2. So this is going to be about 10 to 25 minutes long. So after we've moved through that stage 1, we have more deceleration of our brain waves. So we see on the top, our stage 1 is there still for reference, and then stage 2 is underneath. And you find that all of stage 2 ends up looking an awful lot like what we identified as theta waves. So instead of having sort of that background, very close together waves, we now have sort of more spread out theta waves everywhere with what we also call sleep spindles. And so what's going on in the body here is that our brain is slowing down, our heart rate slows down, our body temperature decreases, our muscles start relaxing, our eyes stop moving, so everything is shutting down for deep sleep. And these sleep spindles are sort of really small clusters of rapid brain activity. So we can see that they're a lot higher amplitude and higher frequency than anything else around there. So it's a second or two of just really rapid brain energy before we go back into sort of normal stage 2. Another thing that I've started seeing creep into textbooks, but not all textbooks, are K-complexes. So this is probably something newly described that's just transitioning over into intro texts. So the diagrams that I use don't have those K-complexes quite yet, but we have a new EEG output there where we can orient ourselves, we can see our sleep spindles and theta-looking background waves, so that's fine. But now we also see a K-complex. And this is a period of neural excitation followed by neural inhibition. So we see a really rapid high amplitude firing and then a really low on the other side and then back to normal. So that's sort of a very quick, intense burst and then back to normal. So those are two things that exemplify our stage 2 sleep. And then this is where they start lumping things together. So stage 3 and stage 4 are both what we call slow wave sleep. So again, we're getting higher amplitude, lower frequency. We start seeing what are now called delta waves. So what I use as an indicator of which one we're in is if delta waves are starting to appear, if we're seeing a couple of them, that's stage 3. If it is entirely dominated by delta waves, then it's stage 4. So stage 3 will still have some of that lower amplitude, higher frequency stuff in between the delta waves, but in stage 4, it's all delta waves pretty much. And so this will usually kick in about 15 to 20 minutes after stage 2 starts, and it usually takes in total 30 minutes or so to get here. And once you get to stage 3 or 4 sleep, this slow wave sleep, you tend to stay here around 30 minutes, but as we're going to see in just a couple of slides, we spend differing amounts of time in different stages depending on what time of night it is. So when we first fall asleep, we spend a lot more time in this deeper slow wave sleep, and then as the night goes on, we'll spend less and less time in this stage. And this is really important for us to feel rested, so it kind of makes sense that we'd spend a lot of time in this at first, because that rest and recovery is the important part of sleep. So we'll sort of have deep sleep early on, and then once we're sure that we've got enough rest, then we can have the other kinds of sleep take over. And when we're in that slow stage of sleep, that's kind of when we start seeing this cyclical aspect of sleep. So we've dropped from stage 1 to stage 2 to 3 to 4. We're down in the lowest levels of sleep, the deepest sleep. And then we move backward through those stages. So you go from 4 to 3 to 2, and then instead of sort of transitioning over into waking up, we hop into what's called REM sleep. And that's called this because of rapid eye movement. So this is our big indicator for REM sleep, is that our eyes have been still for most of the night, but during this stage, we see our eyes move a lot. So we might also call this stage 5. So this makes up 20 to 25% of our total night's sleep. So we spend quite a bit of time in REM sleep. And this is another one of those stages where we spend differing amounts of time in it depending on how long you've been asleep. So when we start, you might only get 20 minutes of REM at a time. But towards the end of the night, you might be staying in REM for an hour or more at a time. So as time goes on, you're going to spend more and more time in REM sleep and less time in that slow wave stages of sleep. And then the really neat part to note here is if we're looking at our EEG output, so stage 3, we're kind of getting deeper and deeper and deeper, and then with REM sleep, we're sort of moving back up again, and that looks not like any of our other sleep cycles at all. But it does look familiar. So if we hop to my next slide, we'll just focus on the green side here. Our REM sleep pattern looks an awful lot like awake and alert brainwaves. That looks pretty darn close to beta waves to me. And in fact, a lot of the activity that's going on in our brain is very similar to what we're doing when we're awake, but we're asleep. So it's this really paradoxical sleep where our brain is acting like it's awake, but our body is acting like it's asleep. And for the longest time, there was a lot of confusion here. People assumed that all of this extra brain activity, this must be when we're dreaming. So people must dream during REM sleep. And we do dream during REM sleep, but not exclusively. We also dream at other times of night. And I actually have a neat diagram to show that in just a couple of slides. So it's not that REM sleep is the only time that we dream. It is a time that we dream, but we also seem to be doing other stuff too. And then I have two different diagrams here because I find that each textbook has its own sort of perspective on this. I really like the green one because it still separates out our stage 2 and 3. The other side shows that new addition of the K complex at stage 2, in addition to the existing sleep spindles. But then they lump together our stage 3 and 4 as slow wave sleep. So neither diagram does everything on its own. So I give both so that you get sort of a different perspective on that. This is one of the benefits of having used a lot of different intro textbooks, is I get to pick and choose which diagrams I like. And on that topic of picking diagrams, this is another kind of diagram. This is a hypnogram, which is basically a fancy way of saying it's showing us what stage of sleep we're in at different times of night. So our x-axis on the bottom is just how long we've been asleep, and our y-axis is different stages of sleep. So being awake down to our slow wave sleep and back again. So this shows that little cyclical nature. But I actually have another diagram that I like just a little bit better. And this one breaks down our stage 3 and 4 again. Stage 3 doesn't seem to last very long. We tend to hop all the way down to stage 4 pretty quickly, but that's all right. So to orient ourselves here, we have extra information at the bottom. That's why I like this one. So it shows us when dreams occur, and we see that they happen at all stages of sleep. We do get a lot of them during REM sleep, but they're not exclusive to REM sleep. And the way they study this is they'll have people in a sleep lab, and they'll be monitoring their EEG output, and they'll say, okay, well, today we're studying stage 1 sleep. So I'm going to let my participant get to stage 1, and then I'm going to wake them up and ask them what they remember. And if they remember dreaming, then it's probably because we interrupted them mid-dream. Okay, what about when they're in stage 2? What happens then? And so they can do this on lots and lots of different participants, and they find that you get reports of dreams at all stages of sleep. We can also see our eye movements quantified in a very weird way at the bottom there. So we see most eye movement during REM sleep. Our eyes can move during other stages, but not in the same quantity. All right, so that's the extra info. What we actually care about is the stuff at the top. And that's that pattern that we see as we move through those cycles. So when we start, we are relaxed, we drop down to stage 1. We don't stay at stage 1 very long, especially at the beginning. We find that we have sort of a really quick drop down to stage 2 that first time through. So 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. Stay at 4 for a while, half an hour or so, and then we're going to sort of climb back out. So from 4 to 3 to 2, and then instead of going to stage 1 or wakefulness, that's when we have our first REM cycle. And as I said before, first introduction to REM is only very short, maybe 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to drop back down again to 2 to 3 to 4. But this time we spend less time in stage 4, maybe only 20 minutes or 15 minutes, and then back up to REM, and the REM cycle is longer this time. and then back down to deep sleep, but this time maybe we don't get deep enough to hit stage 4 sleep. Maybe we only see periodic delta waves, so we can only call it stage 3, and that's even shorter. So then we hop back up to REM 3, REM 3 is even longer again, and then the next time around we don't even go to stage 3, we only go to stage 2. So you can kind of see this fluid change where our deep sleep gets less and less as time goes on, our REM sleep gets more and more as time goes on. We have this sort of predictable cycle of stages. All right. So our next thing that we can chat about is, okay, so we sleep, and we sleep in that particular pattern, but why? Why do we sleep? And you're going to find this pattern with all of our discussions of sleep and dreaming and most of our consciousness stuff, where we have lots of different theories about what might be going on, but we don't necessarily know, we don't necessarily have a good solution. So you're going to find a lot of proposed hypotheses with sort of given evidence for each, why each might be the case, but not necessarily sort of proving any of them correct. So you're going to find that we'll talk about a lot of possibilities and a lot of things why people think it's one or the other, but we're not going to have a hard decision on what's actually going on. So just to kind of temper your expectations as we move through the rest of the chapter. But our first hypothesis about why we sleep is that we evolved this sleep as a shutdown, a way to save energy. So if it's dark for large portions of our day, we don't want to be out wasting energy while we can't be working, so we should sleep to save that energy until we can actually go out and get food and stuff. Hypothesis 2 is pretty close to that, but it focuses in on why we don't move while we're asleep. And this says that the immobilization is adaptive because it helps keep us out of danger. So if we're shutting down, and we're doing so at night when we shouldn't be out in the wilds, by being sort of kept in one place, we're not wandering out in the dark, we're not attracting attention from predators, we're not doing any of that sort of stuff. And so that one we don't have really any hard evidence for. We have sort of the logical, it makes sense that if you're not moving while you're asleep, you're not attracting attention. For our conserving energy, we've already talked about the fact that we have reduced heart rate, lower body temperature. We move less, so we're obviously conserving energy, but it's that cause of that being a driving factor for sleep that we can't be sure of. So either of those could be a case. Hypothesis number 3 is focusing in on the fact that when we sleep, we restore energy and other resources. So we mentioned that when we're in that slow wave sleep, our body is resting and recovering. So maybe our brain is restocking on chemicals that it used up during the day. So while we're not doing a lot of activity, it's kind of replenishing all of our resources. And our evidence for this one is kind of multifaceted, one of which is if you interrupt someone's sleep. If we are sleep deprived, then we have a lot reduced brain function. So we'll have sort of reduced cognitive capacity, we'll have slower reaction times, all of these things. And we will then sort of recover and sleep additionally to try and recuperate some of what we've lost. So there's some evidence for that one as well. So none of these are mutually exclusive. They could all be the case, but these are sort of just different aspects that we could focus on. And we can zero in on the functions of different types of sleep. So our slow wave sleep, we talked about being restoration, and how when we're deprived of that sleep, we have cognitive deficits. That makes sense. But REM sleep might also have function. And so here, the idea is that REM sleep is involved in our consolidation of memories. So we haven't talked about memory quite yet, but the idea is that when you've experienced things during the day, when you stop for the night, you need to store away that useful information, anything that you want to remember for the future. So this process is called consolidation, where you take all of that information and store it away in long-term storage for later access. And so the idea here is that during REM sleep, it helps facilitate this consolidation. So it helps you store those memories in an effective way. And their sort of evidence for this is that when people are deprived specifically of REM sleep, so again, if you have a sleep study and you measure their brain waves and you wait until they're in REM sleep and then wake them up so that they don't get a lot of REM sleep, we see what's called a rebound phenomenon, where basically as soon as they're allowed to sleep uninterrupted, they have much longer periods of REM sleep than they would normally. So if they're deprived of REM sleep, they overcompensate for it. So that gives us this idea that REM sleep must be important or essential for something. And there's some evidence that missing out on REM sleep can interfere with memory formation, but there's also some evidence that just missing sleep in general is bad for memory formation, so it's kind of hard to narrow in on that one. But those are a couple of our theories about sleep. And we've already kind of talked about sleep deprivation, but we can have its own slide here. So that's just our term for missing out on that required amount of restful sleep. And sleep deprivation can happen in one day or across multiple days. I always find it interesting to lecture about sleep deprivation to students because that is one of those big groups that really experiences sleep deprivation. And you can accumulate this loss over multiple days. So if you have sleep deprivation over many, many days, you can get what is known as a sleep debt. And there's a strong misconception with sleep debts that whenever you sort of incur a debt, you kind of track however many hours of sleep that you've missed. And then when you get to sleep, you're going to recover all those missed hours of sleep. And in fact, it's not so much a 1-to-1 ratio. If you miss, say, all week, you're going to miss like 4 hours of sleep every night. You're only going to sleep half as long as you should have, and you're going to incur multiple days of 4 hours less sleep than you should. By the end of the week, you're going to be out more than a day of sleep. And when you're able to sleep, you're not going to sleep for a day and a half. That's a coma. That's not sleep. So instead what happens is maybe you're going to sleep for like 12 hours. And then that way you're recovering some of that sleep debt, but it isn't so much a 1-to-1 exchange. And I've kind of mentioned, I guess, indirectly that people tend to need between 7 and 10 hours of sleep a day. There are all of those biological factors that influence how much sleep we need and our optimal levels. I am one of those unfortunate souls that needs a lot closer to the 10 hours than the lower amounts. But there's actually a genetic mutation to the gene DEC2, if you're interested, and it makes people less prone to sleep. So these individuals with this mutation can survive with like 3 to 5 hours of sleep a night instead of the 7 to 10 that you should have. And they seem to have no detrimental effects of it. So I'm quite jealous of that population. I was also going to mention, I didn't put it in my notes, but when we're younger, so when we're children, you tend to sleep a lot more. So especially as infants, you can sleep sort of 17 plus hours a day. When you're toddlers and young children, you're going to sleep maybe 12 hours a day. And as you get older, you need less and less sleep. And this pattern actually continues into old age where when you're sort of much older, you might need only 6 hours of sleep a night and still be perfectly fine to function. So that seems to be a pretty consistent pattern. And of course, if we're going to talk about sleeping, we might as well also talk about sleep disorders, so different problems with sleep. Insomnia is one of the most common types of sleep disorder, and this is the inability to fall asleep or the inability to remain asleep. So this is one part that people tend to miss. Insomnia, you just assume is you can't fall asleep. But some people can fall asleep just fine, but then end up waking up periodically throughout the night. And waking up repeatedly interrupts that natural cycle of sleep and can become very detrimental because maybe you're not getting as much deep sleep as you should. So that kind of insomnia is still insomnia, even though we don't think of it that way. And we can have insomnia from a bunch of different sources. Conditioned insomnia is an interesting one, and it results from conditioning or associations, things that we've learned. So when I was a student, I lived outside of a town that had a bus that could get me to school. So my town didn't have a bus, so I'd have to get up drive to the nearest town, then get on the bus, take the bus into the city, and that was all for an 8 a.m. class. So for years, I was getting up at 5 a.m. to go to class. And even when I stopped being a student, even when I started working a normal 9-to-5 job, I'd find myself waking up every single morning at 5 a.m. because I had been conditioned to wake up early. It didn't matter if I had been up late the night before, I would always wake up at that time. So I could result in having less sleep, having trouble staying asleep, even though I was exhausted because of conditioning. We can also have idiopathic insomnia, where it's caused by some kind of physiological abnormality. So whether it's an existing condition or something caused by brain damage, it's just got a physical cause to it. We can also have the opposite of insomnia, and this is hypersomnia, where you have excessive sleepiness. And this is without reasonable cause. So you could be sleepy all the time because you're never sleeping enough. That isn't hypersomnia. But if your body is, say, overproducing melatonin, that would be one cause of hypersomnia. So you're always sleepy because the hormone that tells you to go to sleep is in large supply. So that's insomnia. We can also talk about narcolepsy, and this is that uncontrolled urge to fall asleep. This is a really interesting one, and that's, for me, it's because of the genetic factors involved. So with narcolepsy, they've been able to identify a couple of different genes that are involved, and in lab animals, they've been able to breed strains that have these genes so that they can have entire populations that all have narcolepsy. There's actually a sort of naturally occurring example of this. There's a breed of goats. I'm assuming that they were bred for some kind of purpose. Maybe they have really nice coats or something like that. But they also happened to all have this gene for narcolepsy. And there's a lot of videos on YouTube that you can watch where these goats will be running through a field, and then every once in a while one of them will sort of fall over, lay on the ground for a while, and then get back up again. So that's part of their everyday life. There are strains of mice and rats that have been bred for narcolepsy, so they all have genes that are involved in the process. I believe there's even a type of dog, a strain of dogs that have it. So all of these things make it a lot easier to study narcolepsy in non-human animals. But for humans with narcolepsy, we have sort of this added problem of being bipedal. So if you think about it, if you are standing and narcolepsy hits, your knees might give out and you're going to hit the ground. And that's an awfully long way to fall. So individuals with narcolepsy are at high risk of suffering injuries from that. Specifically, they tend to break their jaw because that's what hits when they hit the ground. So sometimes they'll have a little bit of forewarning. Maybe they feel tired first and will know to sit. I believe there are also dogs that are trained to detect sort of that oncoming session. So they'll notify their owners that you should sit down. But some people will have to resort to things like protective gear, so maybe a chin guard and helmet to make sure that they don't hit their head if they were to fall asleep while walking. So lots of potential problems there. Could also talk about sleep apnea. This is another fairly common one. And this is a reflexive gasping for air that ends up waking up someone who's asleep. So if you think of when you lay on your back, you're a lot more likely to snore. And that's because in that position, when you relax, all of these structures, all of the muscles end up relaxing too. And so snoring is just vibrations in all of those structures. But with sleep apnea, that relaxation goes to an extreme, where it can get so relaxed that air can't pass through to get to the lungs. So what happens is your body realizes that you're not getting enough air, and it will wake you up just enough to take a really deep breath to get in enough air to sort of breathe again, and then falling back asleep. And that doesn't sound terrible if it happens just once, but people with sleep apnea can have this happen dozens or even hundreds of times a night. So if you are constantly being woken up by your body's inability to keep sleeping, or to keep breathing, it's going to start interrupting your sleep. And so again, we could have no ability to get all the way down into that deep sleep stages And so you might wake up feeling exhausted because you didn't get any recuperative sleep, even though you were technically asleep for long periods of time. We can also talk about nightmares and night terrors. So nightmares are sort of the less extreme version. These are just anxiety-arousing dreams. So maybe you dream about something that scares you, and you wake up for a moment and you're startled, but you can take a deep breath and sort of calm yourself back down and then go back to sleep. Night terrors are going to be a little bit more intense. So this is usually associated with non-REM sleep, but this is a lot of very intense autonomic arousal. So this is when your body goes into full fight or flight mode. And so some people with night terrors can wake up in complete panic and they might not even know what's going on. And so when you're in fight or flight mode, you might run or attack someone near you, so you can have these sort of big outbursts. It's a lot more common in children than adults, but it just seems to be some people are more predisposed to it, some are not, and then as you get older, a lot of them will grow out of it. Fairly similar to sleepwalking, where it's a lot more common in children and they tend to grow out of it with age, though not always. And I guess the next big one, or the last big one I wanted to talk about, was REM sleep behavior disorder. And this is basically where when you go to sleep, you suffer what's called sleep paralysis. And that sounds bad, but it's actually intentional. So when you're asleep, all of your muscles kind of disengage so that you can continue sort of breathing and existing, but you're not acting out your dreams. So even though your brain continues to fire, you're not flailing about in your sleep. And so REM sleep behavior disorder is when that sleep paralysis doesn't kick in. So you can have issues where maybe you act out your dreams, maybe you get out of bed, maybe you hit someone. This can all be because you haven't activated that sleep paralysis stage. And you can actually have the opposite problem. One of my students mentioned it in the last class, where they were asking about people who get sleep paralysis, which is when you wake up and can't move. And that's that same sort of intentional shutting down of your muscles, but it persists longer than it should. So your muscles should only be paralyzed while you're asleep, but for some people it sticks around just a little bit longer, so they can end up with sleep paralysis when they don't want to have it. So lots of possible disorders, and I've only just hit on a couple of the ones that I find really interesting, but there are tons that we could talk about. But what I want to do is move on to talking about dreaming, and this is another one of those really interesting topics with lots of potential theories as to what's going on, but no real answers yet again. But we can call dreams just mental experiences that happen while we're asleep. The content of dreams is usually familiar, so you might dream of going to school or going to work or interacting with people that you usually interact with. And this kind of gives some evidence for the idea of day residue, or having spillover from what you're doing during the day carry over into your dreams. This is one of Freud's points about dreaming that we've kind of kept. We'll talk about his theory of protection, dream protection in a moment, and that's one we have definitely not kept. But so we are exposed to a lot of things during the day, and our brain tends to repeat a lot of those patterns at night, so that seems to be spillover from our days. And there tend to be a lot of common themes, so not even just within our own lives, but even between different people. You might have seen entire books on interpreting dreams, and that's because certain concepts seem to be so consistent between different groups that, yeah, this is probably something that everyone dreams about. And it's, again, usually familiar content, though sometimes you do have dreams that are very, very strange, and we'll talk about some theories that help explain just the weirdness. As other neat things about dreaming, we have lucid dreaming. So this is when you're aware that you're dreaming and actually have the ability to sort of control or manipulate your dreams once you're aware of them. And there are ways to sort of train yourself to have lucid dreaming. It seems to be a very interesting concept. And if we wanted to talk about culture and dreams, there seems to be this universality with dreaming, to the point that even individuals who are blind, and even blind from birth, they still dream. It might not have the same visual components that we're used to, but it is something that seemingly all people seem to have. We will vary on how much of our dreams we remember and sort of how we dream, but there seems to be quite a bit of consistency. And even if we look at sort of the topics that we dream about, sort of things that we encounter on our daily lives, dreaming of family and loved ones, all of that seems to be pretty consistent. So that's kind of cool. But if we want to get into our theories of why we dream, there are a bunch of them, and they come from all sorts of different angles. The first, and arguably the strangest, is Freud's idea of dream protection theory. And so if we remember, Freud was really focused in on the fact that our unconscious has all of these sort of repressed, boiling urges, things that are sexual or aggressive, that are sort of under the surface that we're not aware of. And so he had gone on to say that while we're awake, part of our mind acts as kind of like a censor. So this is the ego that suppresses all of those urges and keeps it in that unconscious part of our mind. But when we go to sleep, that ego is less active. It's less able to suppress all of those weird urges. And so dreams are sort of our protectors. They allow us to express and act on those repressed urges in a way that isn't actually harmful or detrimental to our everyday lives. So this idea is that all of those impulses get turned into sort of symbolism and actions in our dreams that help us fulfill all of those wishes and desires that we had in a non-harmful way. Needless to say, this is not a theory that has a lot of support and isn't really held in high regard anymore, but it is an interesting place to start. Our next theory seems to be a little bit more in line with at least my understanding of dreaming, and this is the activation synthesis theory. So this states that instead of dreams being some kind of repressed desire coming out while we're asleep, that dreams are just our brains activating in random patterns while we're asleep. So if we've talked about the fact that our brains are recovering and sort of replenishing things and sort of moving stuff around in our sleep to reset for the next day, then as these things are moving around, we might have activation or depression of activation in different areas. And this can produce a haphazard and chaotic pattern of neural firing. So stuff fires not because of stimulation, but because stuff's moving around in our brain. And when we're awake, our forebrain is tasked with interpreting all of those sensations, the things that we're perceiving from our environment, and making some kind of meaning of it. But when we're asleep, the forebrain doesn't really shut off. So maybe it's taking this pattern of random firing and trying to give meaning to it. It's trying to make connections with random stuff that our brain's doing and make it make sense. And so that could explain why our dream logic is so strange and sort of jerky and inconsistent. And it could just be that our forebrain is just doing its best with random inputs. So the lack of logic comes from the fact that it's just trying to make sense of randomness. We could also look at the evolutionary hypothesis of dreams, and this isn't so much on sort of how dreams came to be or that sort of thing, it is intentionally looking at how dreams came to be rather than what they do. That's what I'm trying to say. And so this is basically the idea that we would have evolved dreams because the stuff that's happening while we dream is beneficial. So this kind of relies on that idea of consolidation during REM sleep, where it helps us form memories. So this theory suggests that the content of our dreams, the things that we dream about, might have biological significance. So if during the day you're learning how to cook for yourself, or you're learning how to gather resources, those are biologically beneficial tasks. And so it would make sense to go over those tasks in your head to consolidate those memories so that you learn them better and remember them easier in the future. So we're dreaming about things that are related to our survival, and it can help enhance our performance when we encounter those situations in the future. That would also say the reasons why we have dreams of, say, running away from things that are threatening would be us practicing to run away from threats in real life. So perhaps we can also look at some of our cognitive theories. So this is more getting into, so what do we accomplish while we dream again? So the problem-solving dream models focus on the fact that when we're encountering problems in our day-to-day lives, we're constrained by the patterns of thinking that we already have. So if you're faced with a word problem, you're going to think about that solution in terms of other word problems that you've seen, in terms of other solutions that you know work. So our awake mind is going to restrict our possible solutions based on experience. But when we're asleep, we lose a lot of those inhibitions. We lose a lot of that structure. And so we can find some creative solutions to problems while we're dreaming without being constrained by reality. Sometimes that can be beneficial, and other times that can lead you to writing down ideas that are the best thing ever that you then look at the next morning and go, that's really not going to work. But it could be helpful if it gives us something that could be translated to real life. We also have some cognitive process dream theories, and these are basically saying that when we're awake, our brains follow the same kinds of patterns. We have very similar thinking thoughts and different sort of pathways that are activated. And then when we fall asleep, that same mental framework, those same pathways are going to continue to be activated. So we're not moving around and acting them out anymore, but they're still happening under the surface. So the idea here is that those cognitive processes are happening whether we're awake or asleep, and we just don't act them out when we're asleep because of that paralysis. And again, none of these are necessarily all right or the only explanation. They're just a bunch of potential ideas that might be related to dreaming and sleep. And that is a fantastic place to stop, because our next section is when we get into alterations of consciousness. So I will let us go here, and we'll pick up on hypnosis and meditation and things like that on Monday.